A poor rancher offered water to his Apache enemies, unaware that this single act would change the war forever. This powerful true story will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And tell me, where are you watching from? Let's get started. Desert wind moved like a whispering ghost across the scorched earth, carrying with it the scent of heat, dust, and coming danger. The sky blazed white, a flat sheet of burning light, and the land beneath it seemed to tremble. This was not a place for the weak, nor for the hopeful, and certainly not a place where mercy usually survived. Yet on this brutal afternoon, a lone rancher named Elias Turner stood at the edge of his dying property, unaware that his next choice would alter the course of a war. Everything around him screamed drought, fear, and survival, everything except his conscience. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, the gesture slow and tired. His well was nearly empty, and the tiny pool of muddy water he managed to pull up felt like a miracle slipping through his fingers. His cattle were thinner than ever, ribs visible beneath dusty hides, and the horses drank only enough to keep breathing. Every morning, Elias told himself the same lie: tomorrow will be better. But the desert didn't care about tomorrow, and neither did the conflict brewing between settlers and the Apache bands that moved like shadows through the canyons. Rumors had become a kind of currency in the frontier towns. One day the Apache was said to be planning a massive retaliation. The next day soldiers were fortifying outposts, ready for a fight no one truly understood. Ranchers whispered about raids, ambushes, and missing travelers. Fear spread faster than wildfire. Elias, however, held on to a quieter truth, stories his father once told him about trading peacefully with Apache families long before everything turned hostile. But memories were thin armor in a land where violence was more reliable than rain. As Elias checked the fence line, kicking aside dry weeds and tightening loose posts, a strange tension pulled at the back of his neck. Something was wrong. The desert had moods, and today it felt like it was holding its breath. He paused, squinting into the distance where heat waves shimmered like ghosts rising from the sand. At first he saw nothing but endless light. Then slowly 3 dark shapes emerged on the ridge, silhouettes sharp and still against the sky. His heart slammed once hard. Apache riders. He knew the stories. Everyone did. Apache scouts never exposed themselves unless they wanted to be seen. This could mean danger or negotiation or something far worse. Elias kept his rifle slung over his shoulder but didn't reach for it. Something about the way the riders moved or didn't move felt different. The lead warrior leaned forward over his horse, not in a threatening stance but in exhaustion. His shoulders sagged. Another rider supported a third figure who slumped heavily, almost limp, held upright only by desperate hands. Elias recognized the signs instantly: dehydration, injury, and the quiet edge of death. The desert fell silent as if listening. The riders made no sudden moves, no signs of attack. They simply watched Elias with hollow eyes, waiting to see what kind of man he was. The lead warrior finally lifted one hand, palm open, not a warning, a request. It was a gesture older than language, older than borders, older even than war. Elias felt the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He was alone, poor, nearly out of water himself. To approach them was to gamble with his life. To refuse them was to deny humanity itself. He stepped forward slowly, each footfall deliberate as he moved toward the fence and into open ground. His throat tightened as he carried the tin bucket, his last real resource, toward the very men others called enemies. The heat felt heavier now, thick with tension. He placed the bucket on the ground, hands trembling slightly, then stepped back several paces. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply offered what little he had and waited. The warriors exchanged glances, momentarily unsure. Then the leader dismounted, every movement cautious, respectful, and edged with disbelief. The warrior knelt beside the bucket as if approaching something sacred. He lifted it, inhaling the smell of water as though confirming it wasn't a mirage. Only then did he drink, not in desperation, but in measured sips, honoring the gift. He passed it to the younger warrior, who drank quickly but stopped himself after a few gulps. The injured man drank last, trembling, his lips cracked and bleeding. Elias watched in silence, feeling both fear and a strange calm settle inside him. For one fragile moment, they were not Apache and settler. They were simply men surviving the same merciless desert. When the bucket was finally empty, the leader rose and met Elias' eyes. There was no hatred there, only fatigue and something harder to name, an understanding perhaps, or respect. Elias motioned gently toward his ranch, signaling that he had more water if they needed it. The warrior shook his head. He touched the wounded man's shoulder and made a gesture that spoke of pursuit, danger, soldiers. Elias understood without a single word spoken. The warriors were not hunting. They were running from violence, not causing it. A decision rose inside Elias before his mind could argue with it. He pointed to the injured warrior, then placed a hand over his own heart, offering help. The Apache leader hesitated. Trust was a rarity between their peoples and a dangerous one, but something in Elias' posture, something in the willingness of a poor man to share what little he had, convinced him. Slowly, cautiously, he nodded. The three riders followed Elias toward the ranch, their horses stumbling with exhaustion, the wounded man barely holding on. Life and death now walked side by side across his dusty land. Inside the small cabin, the air felt cooler but thick with tension. Elias moved with steady hands, gathering herbs, cloth, and whatever supplies he still had. He boiled water, ignoring how little remained in his storage barrels. The injured warrior's wound was deep and inflamed, a gunshot that had already begun to poison his blood. The man clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out even as Elias cleaned the wound. The cabin was silent, except for the crackling fire and the soft, steady movements of a rancher doing what he hoped was right. The leader watched carefully, never sitting, eyes sharp. Elias kept working, applying salves his mother had taught him to make, whispering calm words even though the warriors didn't understand his language. But compassion didn't need translation. What mattered was the intent behind the hands that worked to save a stranger's life. Hours passed like slow rivers. Outside, the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, turning the sky copper and red. When Elias finally finished, the injured man's breathing was steadier, his fever eased. Elias leaned back, drained, sweat-soaked, and exhausted, but satisfied that he had done everything a man could do. The Apache leader stepped closer, his boots silent on the wooden floor. For a long moment he simply observed Elias, as if searching for any sign of deceit or hidden motive. But all he saw was a tired rancher leaning against a rough wooden table, breathing hard from the long effort of saving a man who was supposed to be his enemy. Slowly, the warrior touched his chest, then extended something toward Elias. It was a feather, long, dark, and unmistakably sacred. Elias stared, stunned. Even he knew such a gift was a vow of respect, a promise rarely given to outsiders. The leader murmured a few soft words in his own tongue, but the meaning lay in his tone. Gratitude, acknowledgement, debt. The wounded warrior, still weak, managed a faint nod as if to seal that meaning. Elias accepted the feather with both hands, overwhelmed by a mixture of confusion and humility. He had not acted for reward or recognition. He acted because he couldn't watch a man die on his doorstep. Yet this simple act carried weight far beyond what he understood. As the three warriors prepared to leave, the desert outside felt quieter, almost reverent. When they mounted their horses, Elias stood on the porch, watching them disappear into the copper sunset. Dust rose from their hooves like a fading trail, swallowed by the endless land. Once they were gone, Elias' knees nearly buckled from the weight of what he had done. The reality of it settled slowly. He had aided Apache warriors. If the soldiers found out, he could be arrested. If the settlers heard, his ranch might be burned to the ground. Fear crawled into his stomach like something alive. Yet beneath that fear was a strange peace, a feeling that he had chosen correctly. Days passed with no word, no rumblings of attack or retaliation. Elias went about his routine, though every hoofbeat in the distance made his pulse spike. He repaired fences, tended starving cattle, and rationed water more strictly than ever. At night, he replayed the moment he handed over his last bucket of water, wondering if kindness would come back to crush him. The frontier did not reward softness, it punished it. But deep inside, Elias felt something shifting, as if his land had been touched by a rare, quiet blessing. The feather, wrapped safely inside a cloth pouch, felt almost like a heartbeat. Then one morning just after dawn, the blessing turned to thunder. The faint rumble of many horses shook the ground. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, expecting soldiers, but what he saw froze him in place. Dozens of Apache riders emerged from the hills, sunlight striking their painted faces and feathered hair. Dust rose around them like a storm cloud. Elias' life flashed through his mind. This was it. They had returned, not in gratitude, but in strength. His kindness had been interpreted as weakness. The war had found him. His hands tightened around the rifle, though he knew it would change nothing. But then he saw the leader, the same man he had helped, painted not for battle but for ceremony. His expression was calm, resolute, and utterly without malice. Behind him rode the injured warrior, alive, upright, and strong enough to hold the reins. The riders slowed their pace until they surrounded the ranch, forming a perfect circle without raising a single weapon. Elias stood still, breath shallow. The Apache leader dismounted and approached him, his steps purposeful but gentle. Before saying a word, he placed another feather in Elias' hand, lighter, brighter, more decorated, a higher honor. The leader's English was broken, but the message was clear. You gave water in war. You gave life when others gave death. Today, war stops here. Elias blinked, hardly believing what he was hearing. The warrior continued, explaining that word of his kindness had spread through the Apache bands. They had seen too much betrayal, too much bloodshed from settlers, but Elias demonstrated something rarely seen, humanity without condition. It was enough for them to declare his land sacred. A place not to be touched, not to be raided, not to be harmed by any Apache warrior who rode the vast desert. Mori riders stepped forward, laying gifts on the ground, blankets woven with patterns of storms and mountains, leather goods crafted with skill passed down generations, dried meat enough to supply Elias for weeks, tools carved from bone and stone. These were not offerings of repayment. They were symbols of an alliance, something unheard of between a lone settler and Apache warriors. Elias felt his throat tighten. His land, cursed with drought and fear for years, now suddenly stood under the protection of a people feared by every rancher within 100 miles. His life had shifted in a way he could never have predicted. Word of the alliance traveled fast. Settlers whispered about it in saloons. Soldiers spoke of it around campfires. A rancher, poor, quiet, no one of importance, had drawn a line in the desert that both sides suddenly hesitated to cross. Apache raids slowed. Military patrols eased tension near the canyons. Violence lessened, not because treaties were signed, but because one man had chosen mercy over fear. Some settlers called Elias foolish, others called him lucky, a few called him a traitor. But many, especially those who lived near dangerous trails, found newfound peace because of his actions, all without a single shot fired. Elias never boasted about what happened. He didn't tell the story dramatically or hold up his feathers as trophies. He simply lived his life with a deeper sense of purpose. The Apache visited occasionally, not for help but out of respect. Children of both worlds grew up hearing versions of the tale, some exaggerated, some softened, but all circling back to a single truth. Sometimes the smallest act becomes the spark that changes everything. Elias aged with the knowledge that he had done something rare, something that might never be recognized in history books, but lived on in the hearts of those who witnessed its effects. Long after Elias was gone, long after the desert reclaimed his ranch and scattered its wooden fences into dust, Apache elders would tell their children about the day a solitary rancher offered the last of his water to dying warriors. They would say that in a world filled with cruelty, there are still men who choose honor, and settlers, gathered in forgotten towns, would mention the rancher whose courage was not in shooting, but in saving. A simple act, a moment of humanity. A choice that rippled across the silent sands of the frontier, long after footprints faded.